Pay attention to this security camera footage. November 14th, 2013, Oakville, Ohio. Grainy CCTV from an isolated Texaco station captures a seemingly safe interaction. You see Emily Clarke, a 19-year-old college student standing alone at pump number 4. A patrol cruiser pulls into the frame. Officer Ryan Miller, 24 years old, steps out in a crisp uniform, his hand resting casually on his duty belt. He approaches her. Emily doesn't flinch. She smiles, nods as he points toward her rear taillight, and laughs at a joke he makes. It is friendly, professional, for exactly 2 minutes. Then she gets in her car and drives toward the dark stretch of Route 42. At 2:19 a.m., Officer Miller gets back in his cruiser and follows her out of the frame. This is the last time Emily Clarke is seen alive. The night of November 14th, 2013, settled over Oakville, Ohio, with a biting chill that usually signaled the first hard frost of the year. For most of the town, the silence was comforting, a blanket of safety draped over suburban homes and quiet streets. But for 19-year-old Emily Clarke, the silence was just the backdrop to a long, exhausting commute. She had just finished a double shift at a diner near the interstate, her feet aching and her mind already drifting toward the warmth of her bed. The gas gauge on her Honda Civic hovered dangerously close to empty, forcing a detour that she would have preferred to skip. She pulled into the solitary Texaco station off Route 42, the only island of light in a sea of rural darkness. She stepped out of the car, the smell of gasoline and cold pavement filling the air. Emily was vigilant, the way young women are taught to be vigilant. She scanned the perimeter, clutching her keys, her eyes darting toward the dark edges of the parking lot. When a pair of headlights swept across the pavement and a vehicle turned into the station, her heart initially skipped a beat in panic. But as the car drew closer, the panic dissolved into instant relief. It was a Crown Victoria, a police cruiser. The distinct black and white markings were a universal symbol of safety, a promise that the monsters stayed away. She relaxed, her shoulders dropping as she turned back to the pump, unaware that the very thing she trusted was about to become her greatest threat. Inside that cruiser, Officer Ryan Miller was not there by accident. He hadn't pulled in for coffee, and he hadn't stopped for fuel. He had been watching. 3 miles back, he had spotted the lone Honda Civic drifting slightly over the lane divider, fatigue, likely, but to Miller it looked like opportunity. He had turned his headlights off and trailed her from a distance, a silent shadow observing her movements, assessing her isolation. Miller was 24 years old, a golden boy of the department with a perfect service record, but beneath the pressed uniform and the polished badge lay a predator's instinct that had been festering for years. He watched her through the windshield, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. No other cars, no clerk visible in the window, just a vulnerable girl under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. Miller stepped out of the cruiser. He adjusted his belt, a habitual movement that emphasized his authority, and walked toward her with a practiced, confident stride. The surveillance footage captured the interaction with chilling clarity. Emily looked up, startled at first, but then a smile broke across her face. She recognized the uniform. She recognized the authority. To her, this was a public servant. To him, this was a hunt. Miller didn't approach her with a weapon drawn. He approached her with a charm that was far more dangerous. He gestured toward the rear of her vehicle, pointing out a taillight that was supposedly flickering. A classic pretext, a lie designed to test her compliance. The conversation lasted exactly 2 minutes. Emily laughed at something he said, a sound that would later haunt her family when they realized how comfortable she had felt in those final moments. She thanked him. She actually thanked him for looking out for her. In her mind, she was lucky that a police officer had been there to warn her before she got a ticket. In Miller's mind, the interaction was a successful screening process. He was checking for a boyfriend in the passenger seat, checking if she was on the phone, checking if she was intoxicated. He saw that she was alone, tired, and completely trusting of his badge. He had what he needed. Miller gave a friendly wave, signaling that she was free to go. Emily finished pumping her gas, returned the nozzle, and got back into her car. She pulled out of the station, turning right onto the dark two-lane road that cut through the woods toward her parents' house. She likely felt a renewed sense of security, believing the local police were out patrolling, keeping the roads safe. But back at the station, Ryan Miller did not go inside to buy a drink. He didn't radio in his stop. He didn't log the interaction. As soon as Emily's taillights disappeared around the bend, the mask dropped. The friendly community officer vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating hunter. He slid back into the driver's seat of his cruiser. He waited 10 seconds, just enough time to let her get ahead, but not enough to lose her. Then he did something that violates every protocol of law enforcement safety, but adheres perfectly to the logic of a predator. He reached down and killed his headlights. He switched off his dashboard radar. Ghosting the cruiser, he pulled out onto the road, accelerating silently into the darkness, closing the distance between his bumper and her car, invisible and deadly. Emily Clarke thought she was driving home, but she was driving into a trap from which there would be no return. The dawn of November 15th broke with a cruel beauty, casting a pale golden light over the frosty lawns of Oakville, but inside the Clarke residence, the morning brought only a suffocating silence. Emily's bed was untouched, the sheets still perfectly tucked in from the morning before. Her mother, Margaret, stood in the doorway of the empty bedroom, clutching her phone with a trembling hand, staring at the digital clock that read 6:15 a.m. Emily was a responsible girl, the kind who texted if she was going to be 5 minutes late, the kind who never missed a curfew without a detailed explanation. Margaret dialed Emily's number for the 23rd time since midnight. It rang and rang, a hollow electronic sound that echoed the growing pit of dread in her stomach, eventually diverting to voicemail. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in by 7 a.m. Emily's father was driving the route between the diner and their home, scanning the ditches with desperate eyes, while Margaret made the call that no parent ever wants to make. The police dispatcher assured her it was likely a misunderstanding, perhaps a dead battery or an impromptu stay at a friend's house, but Margaret knew better. The mother's intuition was screaming that the silence wasn't negligence. It was absence. While the Clarke family's world was beginning to fracture, Officer Ryan Miller was calmly concluding his shift at the Oakville Police Department. He walked through the back entrance of the station at exactly 6 a.m., his uniform still crisp, his demeanor unshakable. To his colleagues changing out for the day shift, he looked like a man who had pulled a standard, uneventful night of patrol. He joked about the frost, complained about the coffee, and sat down at his desk to complete the most critical part of his deception: the paperwork. With a steady hand, Miller opened the patrol logbook. He filled in the hours between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., the window of time when Emily Clarke had vanished, with fabricated coordinates. He logged a perimeter check of the industrial park on the south side of town, 10 miles away from the Texaco station and the dark stretch of Route 42. He wrote down the details with precise bureaucratic language, creating a paper shield that placed him far away from the crime he had committed. It was a bold lie, written in blue ink, banking on the assumption that no one would ever think to cross-reference his GPS data against his handwritten word. By noon, the facade of a misunderstanding shattered completely. A patrol unit dispatched to trace Emily's route spotted a glint of metal off the shoulder of a service road near the woods, a mile past the gas station. It was the silver Honda Civic. The scene was frozen in a disturbing tableau of interruption. The driver's side door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. Inside, the keys were still in the ignition, the battery long dead. On the passenger seat sat Emily's purse and her cell phone, which was lighting up with yet another call from Mom. There were no skid marks, no signs of a crash, and no blood. It was as if she had simply evaporated into the cold air. The police cordoned off the area, treating it as a suspicious disappearance, but the lack of violence at the scene perplexed them. It looked like she had stopped voluntarily. It looked like she had stepped out to talk to someone she knew. At that exact moment, while crime scene tape was being strung around Emily's car, Ryan Miller was still at the station, long after his shift should have ended. He wasn't home sleeping. He was in the rear vehicle maintenance bay, hidden from the street. He had pulled his cruiser, Unit 402, into the wash stall. He told the maintenance tech that he had spilled a venti dark roast coffee all over the back during a sudden brake check, a clumsy mistake that earned a sympathetic chuckle. But Miller wasn't just wiping down a spill, he was scrubbing. He had removed the backseat cushions and was aggressively cleaning the upholstery with industrial-grade cleaner, the smell of chemicals overpowering the stale air of the garage. He washed the floor mats, he wiped down the interior door handles, then he opened the trunk. He spent 20 minutes meticulously cleaning the carpeted lining of the trunk, checking every crevice with a flashlight, hunting for stray hairs, fibers, or anything that could link him to the girl the rest of the department was currently searching for. He washed the exterior until it gleamed, washing away the mud from the riverbank, washing away the evidence of where the car had really been. When he finally drove home, the cruiser smelled of bleach and pine, sterile and empty, a perfect void where a crime used to be. 3 days into the disappearance of Emily Clarke, the atmosphere inside the Oakville Police Department had shifted from urgent mobilization to a grim, grinding frustration. The initial canvass had yielded nothing. No witnesses, no screams heard in the night, just a silent car left by the roadside. However, the breakthrough that investigators were desperate for arrived in the form of grainy digital footage from the Texaco station's security system. Detective Sergeant Reynolds, a veteran of 20 years, sat in the cramped audiovisual room watching the time-stamped video from 2:15 a.m. on the night Emily vanished. He watched the Honda Civic pull in, and then his breath hitched as he saw a patrol cruiser enter the frame. He leaned in, squinting at the screen as the officer stepped out. It wasn't a stranger. It was Officer Ryan Miller. Reynolds felt a wave of relief wash over him. If Miller had spoken to her, he might have been the last person to see her alive. He might have a lead. The interview that followed was less of an interrogation and more of a debriefing among brothers. Miller was called into Reynolds' office, not as a suspect, but as a witness. He sat in the chair, posture relaxed, his face the picture of professional concern. When asked about the encounter, Miller didn't hesitate. He smoothly recited the narrative he had rehearsed 1,000 times in his head. "I saw her driving with a busted taillight," he explained, his voice steady and earnest. "I didn't want to light her up on the dark road and scare her, so I waited until she pulled into the station. I just gave her a verbal warning, told her to get it fixed. She seemed fine, Sarge. Tired, but fine. She thanked me, and I watched her drive off safely." It was a lie constructed with the perfect amount of truth. The footage showed a friendly interaction. His story matched the visual evidence perfectly. Because Miller was the department's rising star, the rookie of the year, the guy who always covered shifts, his word was treated as gold. The detectives nodded, satisfied. They didn't check his GPS logs. They didn't ask why he hadn't radioed the stop. They simply checked the box marked last sighting and pivoted their entire investigation away from him, turning their hungry eyes toward the town's registered sex offenders and local parolees. Freed from suspicion, Miller didn't retreat into the background. He inserted himself into the very heart of the investigation. He volunteered for the search parties that were combing the dense woods on the north side of town, miles away from where he knew he had buried her. Dressed in his off-duty gear, he walked shoulder to shoulder with volunteers, pointing out likely areas to search, subtly steering the group away from any location that might actually hold a clue. He was playing a high-stakes game of manipulation, using his badge not just as a shield, but as a tool to control the narrative. His audacity reached its peak when he began visiting the Clarke residence. Under the guise of a family liaison offering support to the grieving parents, Miller sat in their living room, drinking the coffee Emily's mother poured for him. He watched them weep. He held their hands, and then, with the precision of a surgeon, he began to plant the seeds of doubt. "You know," he said softly one evening, leaning in with a look of pained sympathy, "in my experience, sometimes kids have secrets. Is it possible there was a boyfriend you didn't know about? Someone she might have run off with?" He suggested that perhaps Emily hadn't been taken at all, perhaps she had chosen to leave. He fed on their desperation, offering them a scenario where their daughter was still alive, just hiding. The Clarkes, desperate for any hope that didn't involve a body bag, latched onto his words. They began to wonder if they had missed signs, if they had pushed her too hard. Miller sat there, the wolf comforting the sheep, gathering information on what the police knew and what the family suspected, ensuring that every road led away from him. 2 weeks after Emily Clarke vanished, the investigation room at the Oakville precinct had transformed from a hive of activity into a quiet, depressing mausoleum of dead ends. The tips had dried up, the volunteers were dwindling, and the town was slowly, painfully resigning itself to the idea that Emily was gone for good. But Detective Lieutenant Frank Halloway, a man 2 years away from retirement with a reputation for being more stubborn than brilliant, couldn't let it go. He didn't care about Miller's charm or the department's desire to protect its own reputation. He cared about the inconsistencies that kept itching at the back of his brain. Late one Tuesday night, while the rest of the building was dark, Halloway sat before a glowing monitor, pulling up the archival data from the department's automatic vehicle locator, AVL system. The technology was relatively new, often ignored by the older brass who preferred handwritten logs, but Halloway knew that machines didn't have loyalties. He pulled up the digital footprint for Unit 402, Dash Miller's cruiser dash for the night of November 14th, and placed it side by side with Miller's handwritten patrol log. What he saw made his blood run cold. Miller's logbook was a work of fiction, detailed and precise, claiming that between 2:30 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. he was patrolling the erratic perimeter of the Southside Industrial Park, checking door handles and securing loading docks. But the AVL told a different, darker story. The GPS data showed that Unit 402 hadn't been anywhere near the industrial park. Instead, at 2:28 a.m., the blue dot representing the cruiser had traveled down a gravel access road near the Scioto River Levee A, desolate stretch of land used mostly by illegal dumpers and seasonal hunters. And then the dot stopped. For 45 agonizing minutes, the cruiser had remained completely static in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a traffic stop. Those took 10 minutes. It wasn't a break. Officers took those at the 24-hour diner. This was 45 minutes of unaccounted time in a location that offered total isolation. Halloway stared at the screen, the silence of the room amplifying the weight of his realization. Miller hadn't been patrolling. He had been busy. And the location of that digital ghost signal was the first real coordinate they had for a potential crime scene. Across town, in the privacy of his fenced-in backyard, Ryan Miller was unraveling. The confident facade he wore at the station was crumbling under the weight of his own paranoia. He could feel the change in the air, the way Halloway looked at him in the hallway, the way conversation stopped when he entered the break room. He knew it was only a matter of time before they looked past his badge. That night, under the cover of a moonless sky, Miller dragged a rusted metal burn barrel to the center of his lawn. His hands shook as he dumped a gallon of lighter fluid onto a pile of fabric inside. It was the uniform he had worn that night, the shirt, the pants, even the utility belt. He struck a match and watched as the flames roared to life, consuming the polyester blend. The stench of melting plastic filled the cold air, but Miller didn't care. He watched with a manic intensity as the embroidered Oakville police patch curled, blackened, and dissolved into ash. He was erasing the physical link between himself and Emily, turning the fibers that might be found on her body into unrecognizable smoke. But the fire wasn't enough to quell the panic rising in his chest. As the embers died down, Miller's mind raced to the cruiser. He remembered driving off the pavement, the heavy tires crunching into the soft, muddy earth near the riverbank. If they found the body, they would find tire tracks. And if they cast those tracks, they would lead straight back to Unit 402. He couldn't wash away a tread pattern. Desperation clawed at him. The next morning he would need to stage an accident, maybe run over a box of nails, or curb the car hard enough to slash the sidewall. He needed a reason to force the motor pool to replace those tires immediately. He had to strip the cruiser of its shoes before the detectives thought to look down. Miller stood in the dark, the smell of burnt uniform clinging to his skin, plotting how to destroy government property to save his own life, unaware that a digital ghost on Halloway's computer screen had already sealed his fate. The first week of December brought a heavy, wet snow to the Scioto River Valley, blanketing the tangled underbrush in a deceptive layer of white purity. On the morning of December 5th, a group of local deer hunters was moving through the dense thicket near the levee, tracking a wounded buck. They weren't looking for a missing girl. They were looking for a blood trail. Instead, they found a disturbance in the landscape that nature hadn't created. Beneath a partially frozen mound of earth and dead leaves, barely concealed by the fresh snowfall, lay the frozen remains of Emily Clarke. The location was a precise matchdown to the decimal point of the GPS coordinates Detective Halloway had pulled from Officer Miller's cruiser days earlier. The discovery shattered the lingering hope of the town, but for the investigators, it provided the physical reality they needed to move from suspicion to action. The crime scene was a frozen testament to hasty violence, but the most damning story was told hours later in the sterile, bright light of the county morgue. As the medical examiner carefully processed the body, he found that the cold had preserved more than just the victim. It had preserved the struggle. Underneath Emily's fingernails, embedded deep from where she had clawed at her attacker in her final moments, were microscopic strands of dark navy blue polyester. They were specific, synthetic fibers used exclusively in the manufacturing of municipal police uniforms, the silent, irrefutable witness that Miller had failed to burn. While the forensic team was sealing those fibers into evidence bags, the net was tightening around Ryan Miller. The summons to the station came not as a request, but as a demand. Miller, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, had spent the previous night in a spiral of manic aggression. The calm, charming officer was gone, replaced by a volatile tyrant. In the kitchen of his home, he had cornered his wife, gripping her shoulders with bruising force, his eyes wide with a terrifying intensity. He drilled a fabricated timeline into her head, demanding she memorize a script. He was home by 2:30 a.m., they were in bed. He never left. When she hesitated, confusing the details of his lies, he smashed a plate against the wall, screaming that her stupidity would ruin his career. He called old high school friends, vague and menacing, reminding them of favors he'd done, subtly threatening them to keep their mouths shut about his character or past behaviors. He was trying to build a fortress of lies, but the foundation was already rotting. When Miller walked into the interrogation room, he expected the usual deference shown to a brother in blue. Instead, he found Detective Halloway and a state prosecutor waiting for him, the air thick with accusation. They didn't lead with the GPS, they led with the body. They told him Emily had been found. They told him about the fibers. The transformation in Miller was instantaneous and grotesque. The facade of the local hero dissolved, revealing the malignant narcissist beneath. He didn't cry. He didn't express remorse. He got angry. He leaned forward, his face contorted with a sneer, and attacked the victim. "She was a tease," he spat out, his voice dripping with misogyny. "You check her phone? She was probably out there meeting guys. If she got in my car, she wanted to get in my car." In his desperate attempt to rationalize the contact, he inadvertently placed himself in the scenario. He stopped denying that he was there and started justifying why he was there, painting Emily as the seductress who had lured a good cop into a bad situation. He claimed she had touched him, that she had provoked him, twisting the narrative to make himself the victim of a 19-year-old girl's influence. It was a disgusting display of ego, a refusal to accept accountability that sickened even the hardened detectives across the table. He thought he was explaining away the DNA and the fibers. In reality, he was confessing to the motive power, control, and the rage of a predator who felt entitled to take what he wanted. The trial of Ryan Miller in the summer of 2014 was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a public reckoning that drew national attention to the small courthouse in Oakville. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Eleanor Vance, understood that they weren't just trying a man, they were dismantling a symbol. Throughout the proceedings, Miller sat at the defense table, dressed in a cheap suit that fit poorly compared to the tailored uniform he once wore like armor. He maintained a mask of arrogant indifference, occasionally shaking his head as if the entire process were a bureaucratic inconvenience. But that mask shattered during the prosecution's closing arguments. Vance didn't just rely on the emotional weight of the tragedy. She presented the cold, hard science that Miller could not charm his way out of. She displayed the DNA results on a massive projector screen genetic material recovered from Emily's clothing and the skin cells found under her fingernails, a perfect match to the former officer. It was biological proof that he had been in intimate, violent contact with the woman he claimed he had only waved at from a distance. But the nail in the coffin was a piece of digital evidence that had been overlooked in the initial review. Vance played the gas station surveillance footage one last time, slowing it down to a frame-by-frame crawl. "Watch his hand," she instructed the jury. On the screen, just as Miller turned his cruiser to leave the station and follow Emily into the dark, his right hand didn't go to the steering wheel. It reached down to his belt. He wasn't adjusting his weapon. He was switching off his body microphone and the cruiser's transponder. "He didn't make a mistake," Vance declared, her voice echoing in the silent room. "He went dark." He turned off the eyes and ears of the department because he knew exactly what he was about to do. He wasn't a cop making a stop, he was a predator entering stealth mode. The audible gasp from the gallery signaled the end of Miller's defense. The jury saw the premeditation, the calculated switch from protector to killer. The deliberation took less than 4 hours. When the jury foreman stood up, he refused to look at Miller. "We find the defendant, Ryan Miller, guilty of murder in the first degree, kidnapping, and abuse of public office." The judge, a man who had sworn Miller in just 3 years prior, delivered the sentence with a palpable sense of betrayal. He sentenced Miller to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that the golden boy would die in a concrete box. As the bailiffs moved in, officers who used to share donuts and coffee with Miller, there was no camaraderie. They rough-cuffed him, pulling his arms behind his back with professional force. The click of the handcuffs, a sound Miller had inflicted on countless suspects, now signaled the end of his life as a free man. He was stripped of his rank, his pension, and his name, processed into the state penitentiary system as inmate 49201. The irony was devastating. He was now locked inside the very cage he had helped build, surrounded by criminals who hated nothing more than a dirty cop. The legacy of the case extended far beyond the prison walls. In the months following the verdict, a deep, unsettling fracture appeared in the relationship between the public and the police, not just in Oakville, but across the country. The Miller effect became a whispered warning in households. Parents who had once told their children to run toward a police car if they were in trouble now hesitated, adding a grim caveat, "Call me first." The community's trust, once absolute, had been poisoned. The sight of flashing blue lights in a rearview mirror no longer brought a sense of safety. It brought a spike of adrenaline and fear. People realized that the monster wasn't always a shadowy figure in the bushes. Sometimes the monster wore a badge, carried a gun, and had the legal authority to stop you on a dark road. Ryan Miller had removed Emily Clarke from the world, but he had also stolen the community's innocence, leaving behind a scar on the badge that no amount of polish could ever truly erase. The tragic story of Emily Clarke leaves us with a difficult but necessary lesson. We are raised to trust the badge and to find safety in the presence of law enforcement. However, this case reminds us that evil does not always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, wearing a uniform and carrying the authority of the state. For everyone watching, please remember that your safety is the highest priority. If you are ever pulled over in a dark, isolated area, you have the right to protect yourself. Turn on your hazard lights, slow down, and drive to a well-lit gas station or a public place with people around. You can call emergency dispatch to verify that the officer behind you is legitimate before you stop. Teach your children and your loved ones to trust their instincts. If a situation feels wrong, even if it involves an authority figure, listen to that inner voice. Being polite should never come at the cost of your personal safety. Please help us spread this vital message by sharing this video with your friends and family. You never know whose life might be saved by being more aware and prepared. If you want to support our mission of telling these important stories and seeking justice for the forgotten, please click the subscribe button and join our community. May God bless every single one of you watching this today. May He surround you with His divine protection every time you leave your home, guiding you safely to your destination. We ask the Lord to watch over our children, to shield them from the dangers of this world, and to expose those who seek to do them harm. If you believe in God's protection and want to stand in prayer for the safety of our families and communities, please type Amen in the comments below. Let us stand together in faith. Stay safe, and may God be with you.